January 1944. The jungles of Burma swallowed sound, light, and hope in equal measure. Rain drummed endlessly on the broad leaves, insects hissed from every direction, and the air itself felt heavy enough to bend rifles. For 2 years, the British Indian Army fighting here had been called many things: outmatched, forgotten, expendable. But one name stuck hardest: Slim's Forgotten Army. Neglected in supply, overshadowed by Europe, and pushed back by a relentless Japanese advance, they were expected to hold a line that barely existed. Yet, under General William Slim, this dispirited force was about to reinvent itself, outthink and outmaneuver an enemy that had once seemed unstoppable. When Slim first took command, he found an army barely functioning. Men marched barefoot because their boots had rotted in the mud. Supply convoys arrived late, if at all. Jungle sickness, malaria, dysentery, scrub typhus, claimed more casualties than bullets. Morale was a thin thread stretched across a chasm. Forgotten wasn't poetic exaggeration. It was the day-to-day reality of troops who felt abandoned at the edge of the empire. The Japanese, by contrast, thrived here. They moved with speed and confidence through terrain that baffled their opponents. Their infiltration tactics, flanking through jungle, slipping behind positions, cutting supply lines, had broken British formations in 1942 with alarming ease. Their reputation carried an almost mythic aura: night attacks that seemed to materialize from the trees, unshakable morale, and an uncanny ability to endure hardship. For many Allied troops, the Japanese soldier was an almost supernatural adversary, fearless and tireless. Slim understood all of this the moment he arrived. He also understood that the old style of fighting, slow, road-bound, dependent on convoys and depots, was a death sentence in Burma. The jungle did not forgive predictability. Logistics couldn't hinge on narrow roads waiting to be cut, and an army could not fight well if it believed defeat was inevitable. Slim's transformation began not with sweeping offensives, but with the basics: food, health, training, confidence. Men needed to eat consistently, sleep dry occasionally, and believe their lives mattered to the higher command before they could fight effectively. He pushed for aggressive malaria control, mosquito nets, repellents, discipline in wearing them. He demanded that medical officers be embedded with combat units, not kept at the rear. He reorganized supply so that airdrops became routine, reliable, and precise. If the Japanese wanted to cut roads, let them. Slim's army would take to the sky for its lifeline. The forgotten army slowly became a learning one, adapting to the terrain and adopting a new identity, one that could survive and maneuver where the Japanese had once held absolute superiority. Training shifted too. Instead of drilling on parade grounds, soldiers practiced ambushes, river crossings, and night navigation in thick jungle. Gurkhas, Indian battalions, West Africans, and British troops trained together, blending skills and sharing hard-earned tricks: how to read faint tracks, how to move quietly on bamboo floors, how to sense a Japanese patrol before seeing it. Slim's approach wasn't glamorous, but it was transformative. He turned fear into familiarity. The jungle, once an enemy, became an environment his soldiers could operate in confidently. By late 1943, the Japanese command still assumed the British Indian forces were brittle and slow, unlikely to challenge their dominance in Burma. They expected the next Allied campaign to be another cautious, plodding advance that could be ambushed and encircled. Slim knew this too, and he intended to use those assumptions as bait. The heart of the coming transformation lay in logistics. Slim had realized something bold. If his army could remain supplied entirely by air, then Japanese infiltration tactics lost their sting. They could slip behind positions, cut roads, sever lines. None of it would matter if food, ammunition, and reinforcements simply dropped from the sky. It was a simple idea with enormous consequences. It meant Slim's troops could hold isolated box defenses, resist encirclement, and keep fighting even when surrounded. It meant they could stay on the offensive without waiting for roads to be repaired or convoys to creep forward. Most of all, it meant could dictate the tempo instead of reacting to it. The Japanese, unaware of the shift, planned their next major offensive under old assumptions. Their strategy hinged on slipping around the flanks, cutting supply lines, and starving out isolated units. It had worked brilliantly in 1942. Now, without realizing it, they were preparing to fight the previous war. Slim's preparations for 1944 relied on patience and planning. He studied the flow of rivers, the timing of monsoons, the thickness of jungle around key passes. He analyzed Japanese tendencies, the way they preferred to envelop rather than assault head on, their reliance on speed, the limits of their own logistics. Japanese supply was carried largely by foot, mule, or bicycle through punishing terrain. They had courage and discipline in abundance, but they lacked the industrial reach to sustain long campaigns far from their bases. If Slim could stretch them, force them to chase, pull them deeper into hostile terrain, their strength would fracture under its own weight. This was the core of his vision: outrun the Japanese not on roads or open plains, but in planning, logistics, and endurance. The Forgotten Army would become a force defined not by what it lacked, but by what it could sustain. By early 1944, the first signs of transformation were visible. Patrols moved deeper into the jungle with confidence. Air-supplied units practiced defensive boxes, testing their ability to survive encirclement. Engineers carved rough airstrips from patches of flat ground, some so short only veteran pilots dared to land there. Wireless operators trained to maintain constant contact, even in remote valleys where signals died in the canopy. Slim's army, once brittle and unsure, was learning to bend without breaking. The Japanese noticed the change, though they didn't yet understand it. Patrols reported fiercer resistance. Ambushes were met with calm counter-ambushes. British Indian units fought longer, retreated less often, and seemed strange in their persistence. Commanders chalked it up to temporary determination. They assumed the old weaknesses would reappear once pressure mounted. But Slim wasn't building temporary resolve. He was preparing an army to outmaneuver the Japanese in a campaign that would unfold across rivers, jungles, and mountains. A campaign where endurance and adaptability mattered more than raw firepower. His men were about to prove that they were not forgotten at all. They were becoming the force that would break Japan's hold on Burma. February 1944. The Japanese had watched the British Indian Army fall back for 2 years. So when reports trickled in that Slim's forces were holding out longer than expected, they barely blinked. A stubborn patrol here, a well-laid ambush there, none of it seemed to threaten their dominance. What they didn't see, what they couldn't see from the jungle floor, was the quiet machinery of transformation humming above the canopy. It began with the steady drone of Dakota transports. To the men on the ground, hearing engines above the jungle was like hearing the future arrive. Supplies drifted down in parachute canisters. Food, ammunition, radio batteries, medical packs, landing with soft thuds on clearings marked with colored panels. What used to be a desperate scramble for rations became a predictable routine. Units that once dreaded encirclement now shrugged it off. If anything, being surrounded meant safety from Japanese infiltration. Slim's troops could dig in, call the Air Force, and wait. Supplies would come. Ammunition would come, reinforcements would come. The Japanese had no concept of this kind of logistical elasticity. They assumed that once they cut a road or encircled a position, the enemy would wither as they always had. They were fighting a ghost of the army they had defeated in 1942. Slim's boxes were the physical expression of this new doctrine. Each one was a tight defensive perimeter, sometimes no larger than a few football fields, ringed with trenches, barbed wire, and fields of fire carefully cleared from the jungle undergrowth. An entire brigade could pack itself into a box and hold out indefinitely as long as the air kept delivering. The Japanese would swarm around them, cutting trails, laying ambushes, shouting through the trees in the early morning to break their resolve. But the boxes didn't crack. Slim's troops were no longer road-bound. They were anchored to the sky. The most important test came at the remote outpost of Sinswaya, where the 7th Indian Division held a precarious position during the opening moves of the Japanese offensive. The Japanese infiltrated as expected, cutting approaches and laying siege. The garrison dug in, called their coordinates, and waited. Within hours, Dakotas arrived overhead, dropping supplies through drifting fog. What should have been a doomed island in the jungle became a defiant fortress. Japanese commanders, confused by the lack of collapse, ordered more assaults. Their own supply lines stretched thin as they tried to starve out men who were eating better than they were. Each attack was met with fire from dug-in Vickers guns and mortars stacked deep in the perimeter. The Japanese were discovering, slowly, painfully, that Slim had rewritten the logic of jungle warfare. Meanwhile, Slim's broader campaign unfurled with a kind of patient audacity. He didn't want to stop the Japanese advance. He wanted to pull it in, stretch it, and let the limits of Japanese supply break it. His plan relied on a gamble that his men could endure the initial onslaught long enough for Japanese logistics to collapse under their own momentum. The landscape of Burma made this a surprisingly calculated risk. Japanese forces relied heavily on foot transport. Porters and mules carried their ammunition and rations. They could move quickly over short distances, but extended operations drained them. Slim wanted them deep, far from their depots, far from their railheads, far from anything resembling stable supply. The deeper they came, the more they would depend on capturing Allied stores, just as they had in Malaya and Burma in 1942. But now those stores didn't exist on the ground. They floated down from the clouds. Slim reversed the table completely. The Japanese now depended on capturing supplies that simply landed wherever the British wanted them to. And while the Japanese advanced, Slim's army quietly pivoted into a mobility it had never known. Units practiced leaps along air-supplied corridors, supported by artillery flown in piece by piece. Engineers built and dismantled airstrips in days, sometimes hours. Entire brigades could shift position faster than the Japanese expected, appearing where they should have been too hungry or too exhausted to fight. Nowhere was this more evident than around the Arakan front, where the Japanese launched a bold offensive designed to encircle and annihilate the British 15th Corps. The plan relied on the old formula: infiltration, cutting supply lines, starvation, collapse, and at first it seemed to be working. Japanese troops slipped behind British positions with ease, severed road links, and set ambushes on every trail. Reports came into Slim's headquarters that units were surrounded on all sides. Slim's response was almost casual: "Good, now they can fight." He meant it. For the first time in the Burma campaign, encirclement was an opportunity rather than a disaster. A brigade boxed in at Admin Box, a sprawling supply and headquarters area, became the centerpiece of Slim's new doctrine. The Japanese threw everything they had at it: snipers, artillery, infiltration teams that crept through the jungle at night. But the box held, and every night Dakotas roared overhead, dropping the food and ammunition the defenders needed to survive. The Japanese, meanwhile, were starving. Slim had reversed the equation so completely that the besiegers were suffering more than the besieged. Through March, the pattern repeated again and again. Japanese offensives bogged down as the forgotten army refused to collapse. Every attack drained Japanese strength. Every day that passed tilted the balance further in Slim's favor. What had once been a neglected, demoralized force was becoming something altogether different: a patient, confident, mobile army that understood its environment and trusted its supply chain. It fought with a quiet sense of inevitability. The Japanese could see it too, even if they didn't yet admit it. Captured prisoners spoke of hunger, exhaustion, and confusion. They expected to break the British Indian Army as they had before. Instead, they were bleeding themselves dry against units that would not retreat, would not crack, and would not starve. In the humid twilight of the Burmese jungle, something had shifted. Slim's army, once forgotten, was no longer fighting for survival. It was preparing to win. March 1944. The Japanese High Command, convinced they finally understood Slim's intentions, decided to gamble everything on one bold stroke: Operation Yugo. Their plan was simple in outline, but staggering in ambition. Cross into India, cut the British supply lines at Imphal and Kohima, destroy Slim's forces piecemeal, and ignite a political crisis that would shake the British Empire in Asia. They believed the Indian Army was brittle, that its men could be persuaded or forced into collapse, and that Slim's reliance on air supply was a fragile crutch rather than a strength. It was the last time the Japanese would underestimate him. General Mutaguchi, leading the offensive, assumed he was dealing with the British of 1942, uncoordinated, road-bound, shaken by the jungle. He envisioned overrunning Imphal, capturing its depots, then driving into the plains of Assam before the monsoon hit. Fuel, food, ammunition, everything the Japanese needed would be taken from the British, as they had done so often in their early victories. It was a strategy built on speed and audacity, the same formula that had brought them triumph across Southeast Asia. But 1944 Burma was not 1942 Malaya, and Slim's army was not the same force they had shattered 2 years earlier. Slim knew the attack was coming. Reconnaissance flights picked up unusual movement on forest trails. Patrols reported increased Japanese scouting along river valleys. And Slim, who studied his enemy with a patient curiosity, recognized the signs of a major buildup. Instead of rushing to block the offensive, he quietly prepared his men for the storm. Imphal and Kohima sat like twin hinges on the approach to India. If the Japanese turned one, the whole front could swing open. But Slim didn't intend to defend them with long, brittle lines. He wanted compact, air-supplied bastions that could hold out for as long as needed. If the Japanese wanted to throw themselves against fixed positions without access to British stores, he was more than ready to let them. The Japanese offensive began with startling speed. Columns moved through jungle passes with their usual ferocity, slipping across rivers and along narrow ridges. They cut the road from Imphal to Dimapur, effectively isolating the British positions. Under old conditions, this would have spelled disaster. Reports arrived at Slim's headquarters that units at both Imphal and Kohima were surrounded. Slim barely reacted. His staff expected concern. Instead, he pointed to the supply charts coming in from the Air Force. "They're not isolated," he said. "They're anchored. Anchored to the sky, to the airfields, to the steady procession of Dakotas and RAF transports flying in supplies from dawn to dusk." The Japanese had cut the roads, but they had cut nothing that mattered. At Kohima, the situation quickly became one of the most intense defensive battles of the entire war. A small garrison, outnumbered and nearly out of ammunition, had held a defensive line so narrow that men could throw grenades from trench to trench. The Japanese dug in across the tennis court of the deputy commissioner's bungalow, an image that would later become an iconic symbol of the battle, and fought at ranges sometimes measured in feet. Yet every night, supplies trickled in by air. Ammunition that should have run dry kept arriving. Food that should have spoiled never did. The garrison hung on by the thinnest thread, but the thread never broke. The Japanese, attempting to starve out the defenders, found themselves starving instead. Their supply lines stretched across mountains and jungle, dependent on porters and dwindling caches. Water was scarce. Ammunition had to be rationed. They still fought with extraordinary determination. Nobody denied their bravery, but bravery alone could not conjure calories or bullets. Meanwhile, Slim set the next phase of his plan in motion. A controlled retreat toward Imphal, drawing the Japanese deeper and deeper into terrain that punished every movement. His divisions fought delaying actions, pulling back with precision rather than panic. It was a dance of endurance, drawing the Japanese farther from their depots, farther from food, farther from the hope of capturing British stores. Slim's men reached Imphal bloodied but intact, folding into the defensive rings that had been prepared for exactly this moment. And as the Japanese arrived and attempted to seal the trap, they discovered it wasn't a trap at all. It was a fortress. This was the climax of Slim's doctrine. Japanese infiltrators severed roads? Good. The British didn't need them. They crept behind lines? Let them. It made no difference. They surrounded Imphal on 3 sides? Perfect. That concentrated them in predictable places. Slim's men dug in, radioed their coordinates, and watched supplies rain down from the sky. Then came the monsoon. For the Japanese, the monsoon was a sentence. Trails turned into rivers. Rivers turned into mud flows. Leeches and disease tore into already weakened units. Japanese troops who advanced with the confidence of earlier victories now faced starvation on a scale they had never known. The British Indian Army suffered too. Nobody escaped the monsoon unscathed, but they had medicine, food, and dry ammunition. The Japanese had none of those. What unfolded next was the slow breaking of a myth. For 2 years, the Japanese had been considered jungle masters, the unbeatable force in the canopy. But at Imphal and Kohima, the initiative flipped. The British Indian divisions, once terrified of encirclement, now went on the counterattack while still technically surrounded. Infantry units that had once melted away under pressure now moved with calm discipline. Indian battalions, Gurkha units, British brigades. They all began pushing the Japanese back inch by inch, reclaiming positions that had been thought lost. The Japanese fought with extraordinary courage, but courage could no longer make up for the reality that they were starving, while their enemy was being resupplied by the hour. Their casualties mounted, not only from bullets, but from exhaustion, hunger, and untreated wounds. Their commanders recognized it too late. The offensive that was supposed to conquer India had become a slow motion disaster from which their army would never fully recover. By July, the Japanese lines around Imphal began to crack. By August, they broke completely. The retreat turned into a collapse. The survivors stumbled back toward Burma, leaving behind their wounded and much of their equipment. They were gaunt, hollow-eyed, drained by months of fighting an enemy that refused to play by the old rules. Slim's forgotten army, once dismissed as hopeless, had not only held its ground, it had shattered one of Japan's finest forces in the field. The myth of Japanese invincibility in the jungle was gone. In its place stood a very different truth. Slim had taken a neglected army, rearmed it with skill, discipline, and confidence, and turned it into a force capable of defeating Japan at its own game. By late 1944, the mood in the Burma theater had shifted so completely that it would have been hard to believe this was the same campaign that began in panic and retreat 2 years earlier. Imphal and Kohima weren't just victories, they were proof that Slim's system worked. And once he had that proof, he wasted no time converting momentum into strategy. His army, once known for falling back, was now preparing to do something nobody expected: advance into Burma and take it back piece by piece. But an advance in Burma wasn't like an advance in Europe. There were no open plains, no easy roads, no convenient rail lines to roll armored columns down. Everything, every mile had to be fought for. You didn't just face the enemy, you faced the jungle, the mountains, the rivers, the monsoon, the insects, the diseases. Every operation had to be planned knowing that climate alone could erase an entire brigade if you got careless. Slim understood this intimately, and he built his offensive around mobility and endurance. His men wouldn't chase the Japanese down established roads. They would move across difficult country, forcing the Japanese to respond, stretching their already fragile supply system until it snapped entirely. He didn't want big, dramatic battles. He wanted the Japanese to bleed out through constant pressure. He also had something he never truly had before: confidence in his logistics. Air supply had proven itself during the defensive battles, but now Slim took the idea further. Instead of using airdrops merely to hold positions, he used them to leapfrog entire divisions forward. Engineers built airstrips in places the Japanese never imagined possible. Motor transport followed behind, pushing fuel and artillery into places that had once been considered unreachable. The Japanese, expecting the familiar British pattern of slow, tentative advances, suddenly found their flanks threatened by units that had moved through dense jungle with surprising speed. The psychological shift alone was enormous. Japanese troops, who had once viewed the British Indian Army as predictable and road-bound, now faced an enemy who appeared where he shouldn't, attacked from directions he shouldn't be able to approach, and kept pushing even when the usual rules of supply said he should have stopped. Slim wasn't chasing glory. He had a larger goal: capture central Burma, take Mandalay, and break the logistical backbone that sustained Japanese forces in the region. If he could control the plains and the key crossing points along the Irrawaddy River, he could sever Japanese communications and force them into the kind of disorganized retreat they couldn't survive. But getting there meant fighting across a patchwork of hills, river valleys, and swampy lowlands that favored ambushes and small unit clashes. Slim embraced this reality. He decentralized the fight, allowing brigades and battalions to operate with a degree of autonomy that was rare for the British Army. Young officers, Indian, British, and Gurkha, were forced to make decisions quickly, adapt on the fly, and trust their local commanders. It created a style of fighting that was flexible, gritty, and surprisingly modern. Take the advance toward Kalewa, for example. Japanese forces held strong defensive positions overlooking the river. A frontal assault would have been disastrous. Instead, Slim's brigades worked their way around the flanks, climbing steep ridges in silence, hauling light artillery by hand, and attacking positions the Japanese assumed were unreachable. When the Japanese realized their lines were being turned, they had to abandon well-fortified positions that had taken weeks to build. This pattern repeated again and again. Slim's men didn't attack where they were strongest. They attacked where the Japanese felt safest. Meanwhile, the condition of the Japanese army in Burma was deteriorating fast. Losses at Imphal and Kohima had gutted their best units. Their replacement system was crippled. Their supply lines were stretched to the breaking point. Disease ripped through their ranks. Many were fighting on half rations or none at all. And the monsoon, not the dramatic, headline grabbing part, but the slow, oppressive humidity afterwards, made everything worse. They still fought with tenacity. Nobody denied that. But now, courage had to compete with starvation, exhaustion, and the slow realization that their high command had completely misread the situation. Slim's advance into the Schwibo Plain marked a turning point. For the first time, his forces could deploy in open country. Tanks rolled forward. Artillery could be used effectively in direct support. The infantry, hardened by 2 years in the jungle, moved with the confidence of a force that had learned its craft the hard way and earned every inch of its progress. But Slim didn't let his men get cocky. He warned them constantly that the toughest fights were ahead. The Japanese might be weakened, but they were still dangerous. And the Irrawaddy River, broad, fast-moving, and flanked by defensive positions, would be the next major obstacle. The crossing of the Irrawaddy became one of the most daring and complex maneuvers of the entire campaign. Slim didn't want a direct assault on fortified positions. He wanted deception. He wanted the Japanese looking the wrong way when the real attack began. So he orchestrated a massive feint, convincing Japanese commanders that his main crossing would be near Mandalay. For days, the Japanese shifted forces to counter the expected attack. Meanwhile, Slim quietly moved the real crossing force far to the south, where the Japanese had left only light defenses. Engineers built rafts and ferries under cover of darkness. Artillery was hauled into position. Smoke screens masked movement along the banks. When the real crossing began, it caught the Japanese off guard. They scrambled to respond, but Slim's foothold grew too quickly. Within hours, British Indian units were across the river, forming a bridgehead. Tanks followed, clanking across improvised pontoons. Gurkha and Sikh units pushed inland, widening the crossing before the Japanese could mount a coordinated counterattack. And once the Irrawaddy line broke open, Mandalay itself became untenable. The Japanese fought hard for the city. Street by street, building by building, the old fortress, Fort Dufferin, turned into a stubborn strongpoint. But Slim wasn't fixated on symbolic victories. His real aim was to break Japanese control over the central routes. As soon as Mandalay's outer defenses collapsed, the larger strategic objective was already achieved. The fall of Mandalay shattered the last major Japanese logistical hub in northern Burma. From that point forward, the Japanese weren't retreating in an organized fashion. They were running. Slim's men kept the pressure on, moving south toward Meiktila, a key road and rail junction that would determine the fate of the entire Japanese position in Burma. The fight for Meiktila was fierce, but Slim's army, now operating with a tempo that felt almost relentless, took the town in a brilliantly executed operation that left Japanese planning in ruins. By the time the Japanese realized what had happened, the battle for Burma had effectively turned into a race they couldn't win. Slim's forgotten army was no longer forgotten. It was tearing open the Japanese front with a kind of calm, methodical aggression that came from hard-earned experience. And with Mandalay gone and Meiktila in Allied hands, the path to Rangoon and the end of the campaign began to take shape. The final act was coming, and Slim, always cautious, always practical, knew that if his men didn't finish the job before the next monsoon, the entire operation could still slip away. But he also knew something else. This time, his army wasn't going to be the one caught in the rain. As Slim's forces pushed south in early 1945, the campaign entered its final and, in some ways, most precarious phase. The clock was ticking. Everyone knew the monsoon was coming, and when it arrived, it would wash away roads, turn clearings into swamps, and ground even the toughest vehicles. Slim had lived through 2 monsoons in Burma. He knew what they could do to an army in motion, and this time he wasn't willing to let nature decide the outcome. Rangoon was the key. The Japanese still held the city, and holding it meant they could slow Slim's advance long enough for the monsoon to trap everyone in a logistical nightmare. The British could win every battle on the way to the coast and still lose the campaign if they couldn't take the port before the rains hit. So Slim planned something ambitious, a drive toward Rangoon that relied on speed, improvisation, and a level of coordination across air and ground units that would have been impossible in 1942. His divisions, Indian, British, Gurkha, African, moved like a single organism. They weren't perfect, and the terrain still fought them every mile. But the direction of the campaign was unmistakable. Meanwhile, the Japanese army in Burma was unraveling. The defeats at Meiktila and Mandalay had shredded their supply lines. Communications were breaking down. Units were fighting in isolation, often without knowing where higher headquarters were or whether reinforcements were coming. Disease ran rampant, porters deserted, ammunition stocks dwindled to nothing. And yet, Japanese troops still fought on, often with extraordinary bravery, even when entire battalions were down to a handful of rifles. But courage couldn't fix the math. They simply couldn't stop an opponent that had cracked the code of jungle warfare. Slim's advance south became a series of rapid movements, short, sharp engagements, and constant logistical juggling. Engineers kept roads open under impossible conditions. Transport columns moved along trails barely wide enough for a man, let alone a truck. Air supply remained a lifeline, not just to keep units fed, but to fuel the momentum that Slim needed to outrun the monsoon. And he nearly didn't make it. By April, the weather was turning. Storms became more frequent. The air grew thick and oppressive. Supply aircraft dodged sudden downpours and turbulence that tossed them around like toys. Slim pushed his corps commanders hard, not recklessly, but with a quiet urgency that everyone understood. What finally broke the stalemate wasn't one massive battle, but the cumulative exhaustion of the Japanese defense. Their high command realized they could no longer hold Rangoon. They prepared to withdraw before Slim's men arrived, hoping to slip south and regroup. They wanted to deny the port to the British, but they no longer had the strength to hold the city in a decisive fight. Then came the twist nobody expected. The weather made the land advance impossible, just as Slim's units approached the outskirts. Roads dissolved into rivers of mud, vehicles bogged down, foot columns slogged forward at a crawl. The city was right there, within reach, yet almost unreachable. Slim's solution was a stroke of bold practicality. As his army fought toward Rangoon from the north, an amphibious task force, comprised largely of Indian and British units, sailed down the coast. The plan, Operation Dracula, had originally been devised long before, then shelved, then revived again once it was clear the monsoon wouldn't wait. The landing force steamed toward the mouth of the Rangoon River, supported by carriers, cruisers, and an assortment of smaller vessels. And when they reached the city on May 2nd, they found something surreal. Rangoon was empty. The Japanese had slipped away days earlier, evacuating what forces they could ahead of the monsoon. The streets were quiet, the docks were abandoned. The only welcoming force was a group of Burmese civilians relieved to see the campaign ending. The British Indian troops moved in cautiously, expecting snipers or hidden explosives, but the city had fallen without a fight. Slim's men entering from the north arrived a few days later, trudging through thick mud and worsening storms, only to discover the port secured and operational. The monsoon hit hardest that week, violent, heavy, relentless. If the landing had been delayed even a few days, the task force couldn't have entered the river, the port couldn't have been opened, and Slim's entire campaign would have been stranded. They made it by less than a heartbeat. And just like that, Burma was effectively reclaimed. The rest of the Japanese forces scattered in the jungle tried to reach Thailand. Some made it, many didn't. Disease, starvation, and disorganization broke what remained of their units. Slim didn't waste men chasing them. He focused on restoring order, feeding civilians, and stabilizing the region. He'd won the campaign he once inherited as a disaster in the making. When news of victory reached London, it landed softly, almost unnoticed. Europe was in its final convulsions. The headlines belonged to the fall of Berlin, the surrender of German armies, and the collapse of the Third Reich. The men in Burma, the men Slim half-jokingly called his forgotten army, finished a long, savage campaign and slipped into the background once again. But the legacy of Slim's army didn't end with the quiet. They had done something rare in military history, turned defeat into mastery. They learned the jungle on its own terms. They adapted, innovated, and fought a campaign where air supply, small unit maneuvering, and environmental understanding mattered more than big formations and set piece battles. They proved that morale and discipline could be rebuilt, that an army written off as hopeless could become something exceptional. They were Indian soldiers who fought with fierce pride when many doubted their resolve. They were British regulars who refused to collapse even when outnumbered. They were Gurkhas who brought their own brand of courage to every ridge line. They were African troops, pioneers, engineers, transport drivers, tens of thousands whose contributions rarely appeared in the official summaries, but without whom nothing would have moved. And they were led by a commander who never mistook theatrics for leadership. Slim didn't shout, didn't demand blind loyalty, didn't pretend the jungle was anything but unforgiving. He spoke plainly, planned carefully, and trusted his men to deliver when it mattered. That trust became the engine of an entire campaign. When the war ended, Slim wrote that his greatest achievement wasn't beating the Japanese, it was rebuilding the confidence of an army that had every reason to doubt itself. The men who slogged through Burma remembered the mud, the rain, the impossible marches, the sickness, the loneliness of the jungle. But they also remembered something harder to define, the feeling that they had been part of a force that did the impossible, quietly and without fanfare. The forgotten army didn't stay forgotten among those who served in it, and history, slowly but surely, came to recognize what they accomplished. An army that learned, adapted, outthought its enemy, and in the end outfought one of the toughest opponents of the war. A brilliant campaign, carried by men who were never supposed to win, and won anyway.